that started too. Seems like a good time to restart since we just restarted the recording. So once again, welcome everybody. We're going to go through a little bit of quick housekeeping. Welcome to the celebration of our friend and newly minted author, Dave Thomas. Here's how the schedule is going to go. So like I said, this is sort of our main gathering space, like your usual event hall or a co-working space if we were gathering in the real world. And we're going to be going through a couple of things. Obviously, Dave's going to be reading some choice excerpts from his book. I'm going to be having a little bit of a conversation with Dave about the book itself, some of my favorite pieces, how the book came to be, but maybe most importantly, you're going to have a chance to ask some questions. I'm going to give you some instructions about how to ask those questions when we get a little bit closer to that part of the evening. The second half is something that Dave calls an idea exchange, and I'm going to let him describe that a little bit more when we get there, but it's an opportunity for you to meet each other, which is really kind of what community is all about, right? And in order to do that, we're going to break you up into Zoom breakout rooms, take you through a little exercise and an opportunity to get to know each other. But we've also added one more component, because when you go to an event, sometimes there's the things happening in the main event, but the cool stuff actually happens in sort of the side conversations out in the hallway. And so we're using a tool called Rally, which you should have a link to in your invitation. We'll be turning that on in the second half of the event as well. So you have a choice between participating in the idea exchange or popping out into the hallway and Rally to see who's around, mix and mingle. And unlike Zoom, which puts you in a breakout room where you're kind of stuck where you are, Rally is kind of a space where you can wander and kind of mix things up and enjoy a little bit of serendipity. We're going to keep the house rules kind of simple. Do not be a jerk to anybody else here. Absolutely no racism, no sexism, no homophobia. If you're being a jerk in any way, we've got a team of folks that have got have eyes on things. And so if you are having any sort of trouble with another participant for some reason, if you email eventsupport@indyhall.org, that's going to come to us and let us know what's going on, who it is, and we'll be able to take care of that. But rule number one, we're here for each other and to support Dave. So everybody be cool and we'll have a really good time. I think that's it for my housekeeping. Dave, is there anything else that I might have missed?
Who are you?
Oh shoot, who am I? Hi everybody. Yeah, I take for granted that my name is below my screen. My name is Alex Hillman, the co-founder of Indy Hall, a longtime friend of this guy. I'll share a very, very brief backstory before I let Dave talk about his book. I met Dave 15 years ago now at an event where he was giving a talk that some of you may have heard over the years called Links as Language. And the Links as Language talk was the first time I ever saw Dave speak, but it made me think, I need to be this guy's friend. Like the way this guy thinks and communicates is really special. And if you're here, you know what I'm talking about. So I've had the chance to not only enjoy this friendship with Dave over the years that we've built through the various aspects of the Philadelphia technology community. Dave went on to be a co-organizer of Barcamp and so many other things. But through this friendship that Dave and I have built over the years, it's been really fun to see a lot of the ideas that show up in Design for Cognitive Bias all sort of show up in one place. Sort of been exploring these for a really long time. So it's really, really exciting to read this all in one place and have that to celebrate. So I'm Alex Hillman. I'm your host for the evening, and I'm super excited that all of you are here. With that, Dave, Dylan, Thomas, how are you doing tonight, my friend?
I am good. How well can people hear me right now?
You sound great, man.
We can hear you.
How about now? Because I'm realizing my microphone has not actually been plugged in.
Oh wow, you sound even better.
Oh, good.
You sound like a professional Dave Dylan Thomas.
Yeah, ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to be a David Dylan Thomas. So a couple things. I also want to point out that Alex here recently released a book literally one day after mine called Tiny NBA. It is amazing, and I believe we will end up touching on it in our conversation later. But be sure to check that out. I also want to shout out our facilitators today. Maurice Gaston is helping us out with the rally section. He's going to be kind of moderating things there. And Brianna Morgan is the person in the van for Zoom today. So she's going to be helping us out behind the scenes on Zoom. So thank you both so much for your help.
Fantastic. Dave, before we get into your reading, how are you feeling on book launch week?
it's happy and overwhelmed at the same time. The reception for the book has been kind of amazing, actually. It's, I think, one of the best pre-sellers that Book Apart's seen. And I thank you all for that. It is something that I believe and care deeply about. So again, I thank everybody for the outpouring of support the book has gotten online. The number of photos I've gotten of people posing with the book when it arrives in the mail is very heartwarming. I didn't have to ask anyone to do that as like a publicity stunt. They just did it. But what's really heartwarming about the enthusiasm is it is enthusiasm for a thing that I care deeply about, which is design justice and design ethics. And as we sort of go through the book, you'll kind of see how that manifests. But like, I'm happy that it's popular, but I'm more happy that the thing that's popular is something that I think is good. So that's kind of how I'm feeling right now.
That's awesome. Cool. I've got one more sort of note for the folks that are here. As Dave is doing his readings, if you have a question that you want to answer in Q&A that pops up at any point in time, if you want to drop that in the chat room, one of the things that would be super helpful to us is if you prefix it with either text or video to let us know if you want basically me to read your question, and I'll obviously give you credit, or if you'd like me to unmute you and you can come on screen and ask Dave the question directly. Both of those are options. Totally up to you. So prefix your question with either text or video, and we'll go from there. With that, Dave, I think we should get into some choice readings from your new book.
Cool. So this is the book. Yeah, by the way, it is mind-blowing to actually physically hold like a copy of a book that you wrote. I have nothing to compare it to. But I do have some choice selections I want to read you. And I want to start by doing something a little unusual. At least I haven't seen it done at a book reading before, and it's potentially a horrible idea, but I'd like to read you the acknowledgements. And don't worry, you're not just going to hear a bunch of random names. Like each of these names has a story, and I kind of want to tell you the story because in so doing, one, I can kind of start this whole thing off with a sense of gratitude, which I think is important, but then two, give you kind of behind the scenes on how the book came to be. So starts out, to Lisa Maria Marquis, who went from that funny, smart person I hung out with at Confab, to the author who quoted me in her book, to the editor who said, "Did you ever think about writing a book? Your editorial eye and tolerance for pop culture references have made this an amazing experience." So I know Lisa Maria Marquis. I knew her from Confab. I met her. She was giving a talk there. And I just got to know her as, hey, you're this really cool writer. We would hang out, with Sarah Wachter-Becher and a few other folks, after the conference. And then she actually quoted me in her book, which was really nice. And then after I gave a talk the next year at Confab, she's like, "Oh, Dave, did you ever think about writing a book?" And I was like, "Oh, this is like an author just sort of making casual conversation." And I was like, "Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, that could be cool." And then I Googled her and found out she was the managing editor of A Book Apart. So I realized, oh, wait, no, you really were asking me a real question there. And so that began the journey. Quick request, can we go from slide to just big giant grid of humans? Awesome, I love seeing lots of faces. To Cattell Ledoux, Karen Litherland, Leslie Zalkus, Jason Santamaria, and the whole team at ABA for making my first experience writing a book incredible. You were all wonderful partners, and I'm proud to have worked with you on this. So A Book Apart is amazing to work with. One of my favorite stories was Karen Litherland, who did the first pass copy edit, like really getting into the details, writes me a note in the first pass. You're going to hear, I'm going to read the introduction, you're going to hear a reference to Black Panther, an actual quote. And she corrected it, which tells me that because of my book, it was someone's job that day to go watch the movie Black Panther. And that was just such a wonderful moment for me. One of my happiest professional moments. To my mother for insisting that I get an education and for telling me ad nauseum that I could accomplish anything. So my mother was this amazing woman. She passed away in 2011. But two things, among many that had an influence on my life, she went into great debt. She went the extra mile and then some to make sure that I had an education. That was something that was deeply important to her. And she put her money where her mouth is and really did everything. She sacrificed to make sure that I could be smart. And on top of that, and not disconnected from it, she hammered home, I could be whatever I wanted. Like, I never doubted that she loved me, and I never doubted that she believed I could be anything and anyone I wanted to be. And I know I would not be here now doing this if it were not for that. So recognize. To my wife, Nina, and son, Kieran, for supporting me throughout this process during the writing of this book. I was diagnosed with clinical depression. I would not have made it through that without the constant loving support of my family. Then the pandemic hit, and I was quarantined with my favorite people in the world while I finished the book. I love you both so much, and thank you so much for being there with hugs and belief in me. So that's for real. Like August of last year, I got an email saying that a Book Apart was interested in doing this. Like, we're actually going to write a book. That same month, I was diagnosed with clinical depression, and I started antidepressants, and I started therapy. Now, in retrospect, I am very glad both of those things happened in 2019 before 2020, because I am trying to imagine what it would be like to try to deal with 2020 without being on antidepressants and without therapy. So weirdly, the timing could not have been better, but obviously it is not an easy thing. And I mentioned that, and I try to be very transparent about that, because I believe there are people out there who would benefit from knowing, hey, this shit happens and it is not difficult, but you are not alone. And I know for me, knowing that certain authors like Jenny Lawson and a couple other folks have done great work while suffering from clinical depression was really important for me to know while I was going through it, or beginning to realize I was going through it. It's not really over. It meant a lot. So that's why I tend to be very transparent about that. But at that moment, it was really Nina who supported me in saying, hey, we should probably get this checked out. So I finally got my diagnosis. My son, who also has sort of attention deficit issues and is also on medication for that, we became kind of mental health buddies, which was a really supportive, helpful thing. So without them, none of this happens. To my God, parentheses, connection to the universe, spiritual center, whatever works for you, close parentheses, for grounding me, centering me, and helping me keep those who could use the most help in mind. So I'm a very spiritual person. I don't talk about it a lot in the book. I come from a place of Christianity, but I tend to skew towards the Jesus really cared about poor people place of Christianity, not the Jesus hates gay people part of Christianity. So I tend not to talk about it a lot, but like, I feel like that has always been a part of my life, that spirituality, that connection, whatever you want to describe it as. And it helps me. I think it's the moral center of where this book is coming from, is this notion of you should really be thinking about people with less power than you. To speak of Run the Jewels, like they have a great line, where it's like, remember in the story of Jesus, he was killed by the state. Like, it's a really important line, right? But it's that through line between my spiritual beliefs and kind of what I'm writing about in the book. To the work colleagues who helped give me ideas to shape this book, including Sun Quan Bush, Neha Arakawal, Holly Munson, JT Coble, Colleen T. Reese, Stan Singer, Sean Hickman, and Erica Wolstrader. So I work at Think Company. It's a very good company. We work through stuff just like every other company, and I've been a part of trying to do that and make us better on things like diversity and equity and inclusion. But the people who work there already kind of had a mind for what this book could be. And I followed the advice of Lisa Marie Marquis when I started writing, saying, hey, talk to some of the people you think might want to use this book and ask them what they would want to use it for. And all the folks I just named gave me amazing insights to help understand what this book could be. In particular, I want to call out JT Coble, who I think is at Berkadia now, but he helped give me insight into the history of these discussions that we've been having about design and ethics, which may seem like new discussions, but go as far back as design. Like Bauhaus was trying to wrestle with a lot of this too. Like, this is not new. We are just the latest chapter in a very, very long struggle. To Think Company for providing me the time and space to write this book, and to Russ Stark in particular for believing in me and this project the whole way through. And I think Russ is actually on this call. Hi. So like I said, I work at Think Company, and I'll be honest, this book would not have happened as quickly had not Think Company believed in it and said, hey, Dave, you can literally use work time to work on this, and a significant amount of it too. So I will never forget that. And Russ in particular, who's the CEO, we're friends, and he never, it was never a discussion. It was just sort of like, hey, I think maybe I should work on this book. And he's like, what are you talking about? Go, do it now. What are we waiting for? So that support was vital, and meaning that this happens now and not like a year from now. So I'm thankful for that. To deep thinkers like Jeff Eaton, Greg Dunlap, Margot Bloomstein, who I think is on the call, Malika Carpenter, Erica D. France, Mike Montero, Erica Hall, Maurice Gaston, Brianna Morgan, Derek Powazik, David Fiorito, Tim Wisniewski, Julie Polk, J.G. Sanders, Josh Greenberg, David Bornstein, Paolo Malabuyo, Andy Wellflay, Saskia Videller, and Chris Alfano for helping me find examples and craft some of the key ideas in this book. So everybody I just named has been very inspirational. It has given me insights. These are people sort of in my immediate orbit or in the community of practitioners I work with. And, you know, I call them deep thinkers. They're not just trying to get the work done. They're trying to get the work done thoughtfully. And a lot of the ideas you'll see in this book, a lot of the techniques and practices are coming from that place. So I give them all of the thanks. To Sarah Wachter-Betcher and Kevin Smokler for helping me craft my pitch and giving me valuable lessons on the author life. So this is my first book. I've done a lot of writing in my life, but this is my first book. And so the idea of how to negotiate a contract or like, you know, how to even sit down and do this thing, I would never have gotten that far without two authors. And Kevin Smokler, I think, is also on the call, my best friend, hi, giving me the insights I needed as a first-time author. And that's a couple of things I think Alex and I'll talk about as new authors, like how all of y'all, if any of y'all are thinking about getting into this thing, just sort of what to keep in mind, and mostly just to understand you can do this. To my wife, again, the pediatric neuropsychologist, for being the smartest person I know and for spurring my interest in the brain. So my wife is a pediatric neuropsychologist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She's literally the reason I'm in Philadelphia. That was the job she ended up getting after we met in at Kennedy Krieger at Hopkins. So she has always been interested in the brain, and through osmosis, I kind of learned a lot of stuff about the brain. She introduced me to the works of Oliver Sacks, who, if you've never read, is a brilliant storyteller and genius neuropsychologist who unfortunately is no longer with us. But if you ever read The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, that was the first piece I read that helped me understand that the mind is a wonderful and terrible thing. And I have since continued on my journey of trying to understand just how wonderful it is and just how terrible it is. And this book is kind of the culmination of that journey. To Iris Bonnet for giving an amazing talk that got me interested in cognitive bias. So anyone who's seen me give the Design for Cognitive Bias talk knows the design piece started with me seeing a talk by Iris Bonnet called Gender Equality by Design, which I highly recommend you find on YouTube. It's amazing. But it was her work on pattern recognition that helped me understand, hey, these terrible things where women are getting passed over for promotions or where Black people are getting shot by the police, some of it is just coming back to pattern recognition from shitty patterns society has handed down versus someone waking up in the morning and saying, I'm going to be a sexist. So that spurred my interest in studying lots of biases and getting a podcast and all of that. That talk was really a very important seed. By the way, I actually emailed her when I was writing the book. And I was like, hey, I just want you to know, like, you know, long-time listener, first-time caller. Thank you so much for doing that talk. And she actually wrote back, was like, oh, that's great to hear. I'm like, so. To Liana Dragoman for giving me the speaking opportunity that started me on the path of trying to merge cognitive bias with design, and to Hella Martins for taking it to the next level by inviting me to speak at my first international conference, where I discovered that my talk was actually about design ethics all along. So Liana Dragoman works for the city of Philadelphia and heads up an amazing department there. I like to say that the second best design firm in Philadelphia after Think is the city of Philadelphia. But they have an amazing behavioral science service design team that she helps head up. And she comes to me one day after I'd been doing my podcast for a while and says, Dave, I'm getting together a panel about accessibility for city workers. And I want you to talk about cognitive bias. I'm like, oh, cool. And then I realized that I don't have any design stuff to go with the cognitive bias stuff. So that's when I started doing the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup stuff with that and saying, okay, how can I combine these disciplines? And I came up with maybe a 10-minute talk saying, okay, here's this wacky bias. Okay, here's this design thing to do with this wacky bias. So it's like my type 5, right? So when I got invited to speak at UX Copenhagen, I realized, oh, I need to turn this into a real talk now. And so in doing that, I don't know if anybody who's ever gone through the process of writing a talk before has had this happen, but as I was creating the talk, I found the talk, right? But it went beyond, here's some cool examples into what am I really talking about? And then I got, oh, we have biases. Designers have biases. Oh shit, this is the real stuff. This can hurt people. And became, oh, this is a talk about design ethics. That's what I'm really doing. And you know, this is actually a book about design ethics. Like I didn't put it in the title. It's more like, oh, bias, bias, bias. Gotcha. This is about ethics. Like that's how it's constructed. But none of that would have happened if I hadn't been forced to write those talks by the opportunities that Liana and Helly gave me. To Christina Halverson, Tanessa Melke, and the whole Confab team for giving me the speaking opportunity that led directly to this topic being turned into a book, and for looking after the best darn community in tech. So Confab, if you've never been, is a content strategy conference. It's the content strategy conference, in my opinion. And it is one of the warmest communities you're ever going to find. I like to think Indie Hall, Confab, these are places that have managed to transcend and make community not just a nice afterthought, but their mission. And so it was great to just be part of that community. But then when I spoke, like I said, at Confab about cognitive bias, the first real talk I did about that there, that's what led to not just Lisa Maria saying, hey, you should write a book, but that day I remember 3 or 4 people were being like, hey, do you have a book? And I'm like, oh, maybe there's something here. To Oliver Sacks, Eamon Tversky, Daniel Kahneman, Dan Ariely, David McRaney, and the myriad people doing the research and reporting that helps us understand how our brains work. So I feel comfortable saying I'm a UX expert, content strategy expert, because I've done the work, like I've gotten paid to do it. I've done it with many clients, like I've been in and out of that a million times. I don't necessarily feel comfortable calling myself an expert on cognitive bias. I consider myself more of a super fan, but there are people who are the experts who are doing the research to find out all these crazy things about our brain, and then reporters who are turning that into language and stories that we can understand and follow up on. So I appreciate, again, none of this could have happened without that work. And so I deeply appreciate it and wanted to call that out. Okay. This is a list, but when you get back, you should Google everyone I'm about to mention. 2, Sasha Costanza-Chalk, Anil Dash, Mina Markham, Yasmin Mustafa, Johnny Ray Evans, Rebecca Ray Evans, Mutali Nkande, Mbimu Gogomu, Dana Boyd, Meredith Broussard, Ariel Fox, Ariba Jahan, Jerry McGovern, Sylvester Mobley, Daria Puja, Will Reynolds, Sarah Richards, Baratunde Thurston, Ashley Turner, Annie Rose Webb, Dan Roten, Aline Webb, Gabe Weinberg, Tracy Wilson-Rossman, Gloria Bell, Margot Stern, Evie Chung, Elle Waters, Marche Greer, and everyone else out there doing the work to make tech more equitable. I don't have time to tell you how each of those people is contributing to making tech a better place, but they are doing it. And while I'm spouting theory and trying to inspire you, they're actually following up. And for this, I will be forever thankful. To Brian Crumley for keeping my website in check. So those of you who have been following me for a while may have noticed my website is brand new now and is geared very much toward selling my book or selling the idea that I could come give a talk where you are. None of that would have happened without the brilliant, tireless work of Brian Crumley, who is a bit addicted to work, but I paid him anyway. To all the fans of the Cognitive Bias podcast for your support over the years. So I started the Cognitive Bias podcast in part because Emily McManus insisted that I do it because I kept blabbing on about cognitive bias because I was studying it. But I literally sat down one day and said, okay, I'm going to take the next 10 minutes and just record something. And if you ever listen to the very first episode, you can tell I had no idea what I was doing. You can even hear this pause before I say the title of the podcast because I didn't know what I was going to call it. It's like, so welcome to the Cognitive Bias podcast, right? And that became the name. So I would be lying if I said I put a lot of thought and marketing into, oh, I'm going to make this something people really enjoy. It's more like, okay, I'm going to do it. All the thought went into how can I make this as easy as possible? However, I think that actually contributed to its success because it meant I had to keep it really short. But this community grew up around it of very, very supportive people. And people really seem to love the podcast, which this is probably a good moment to mention. Very, very few people know about this, unless you're on my mailing list. But I am bringing back the podcast for a limited time, starting next week, actually. I'm going to do a series of live, Cognitive Bias live interviews with folks talking about tech and bias and social justice. The first one is going to be next week. I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now. So y'all get an exclusive for coming out to this thing. Thank you very much. But yeah, the first interview is going to be with Christina Halverson next Thursday. So if you want to make it out to that, oh wait, that just went to Larry. Hi, Larry. Everyone else gets to know too. Hold on. To everyone. But there you go. Exclusive. But yeah, so I'm going to be bringing it back for a limited run to promote the book and to kind of keep that conversation going. To Emily McManus for insisting that I go ahead and make that podcast in the first place. So Emily McManus is an amazing person who she was the editor-in-chief at TED. Now she's working at a podcast startup. But every time, once I started studying cognitive bias, every time I would have coffee with her, she would just be like, why haven't you made the podcast yet? Why are you not making the podcast right now? She was very vocal on the subject. But without her, I wouldn't have had the nudge, the kick in the butt I needed to actually get it done. And finally, to all the folks who subscribe to my newsletter and come to my talks and reach out to tell me my stuff is making a difference, thank you so, so much for believing in me. So I will let you inside baseball for a minute here. I have a Google Doc where I keep sort of nice things people say about me. And I do that in part because depression brain, I don't need to do the work to feel bad, but I do need to do the work to feel good. So I keep that thing something I can like remind myself. There's a lot of people who don't think you suck. But that, all of that, it's so gratifying to see that people do care, that it is helping. And what I really care about seeing the best compliment I can get, as much as I love people saying, oh, that's a great book, I really like what you said there, is occasionally I'll have someone say, yeah, I actually changed the design of this product because of what you said, or we are trying to do things differently in our company now, or whatever, some sort of thing where it's like, we're going to actually try to do that crazy thing you talked about. That means everything to me because I know the world doesn't change until people start doing things differently. So if anything I'm doing here moves that needle, I'm eternally grateful. So that's the acknowledgements, which is a weird thing to start with, but I hope it wasn't too dull. Now I want to flip to the exact opposite and go to the introduction. And the introduction was the very first thing I wrote. So the book proposal process for A Book Apart is actually very good because the questions they asked you to answer force you to be very thoughtful about your idea. They force you to craft it and really think, what is this book really about? And how do you want to structure it? And I remember we used to have 2 offices in downtown Philly at Think Company. I was walking from one studio to the other, and it just kind of hit me. And from the time I started the walk to the time I ended the walk, like I heard the entire introduction in my brain. I'm like, oh crap, I need to write this down. So what you're about to hear is more or less based on that. And this is when I nailed the structure of the book, which then meant I know what to do now. Introduction. For much of its history, economics as a discipline focused on how people treated money. It postulated a rational actor. It assumed there was no need to study people, just markets. This assumption is natural enough. We all walk around thinking we understand people. We've grown up with them. We're surrounded by them in our families, our schools, and our work. We are them. Why wouldn't we understand people? Then social scientists started poking around some of the phenomena that classical economics couldn't explain. And we got behavioral economics, which did a vastly better job of predicting outcomes than the I think I know how people think very much approach ever did. That's because economics was really about people all along. Design generally does a better job of understanding people than traditional economics did, but in the wise words of Wakandan design group lead Shuri, just because something works doesn't mean that it cannot be improved. This is a book about people, because design is about people. We design with and for people. The better we understand people, the more effective we'll be at our jobs. In particular, this book is about the decision-making part of people. That's where bias comes in. I hope this book encourages you to think more critically about how people actually make decisions so that your designs better reflect that reality. As designers, we're in the business of helping people make decisions, from the mundane to the essential. Which phone plan to choose, which route to take, which city department to try to get help from, which foods to eat, what to watch. Unless we grasp how people really make decisions, our designs will, at best, be as good at chance as helping them. At worst, they might actively harm them. We work for people, stakeholders, clients, bosses. If we don't understand how they make decisions, we're not going to be very good at our jobs. Either we'll muddle through and let the person who shouts the loudest win, or we'll actively hate our jobs and still produce harmful outcomes for our users. Finally, and this is perhaps the most difficult part, we work with ourselves. If we think maybe we understand how other people tick, we're damn sure we know how we tick. It's hard to come to grips with the fact that we don't actually understand how we make our own decisions. Our own biases are the thorniest to spot and combat, and the most likely to cause trouble for the people we design with or for. That's why this book moves from the outside in. In chapter 1, we'll talk about how people in general make decisions, not the way we think they make decisions, rationally, but the way they usually make decisions, which often makes no sense at all. In chapter 2, we'll focus on understanding and designing for the way our users make decisions. In chapter 3, we'll move on to talk about understanding and designing for the way people we design with make decisions. Finally, and most critically, Chapter 4 will get into the way we personally make decisions and how to stop ourselves from becoming our own and our users' worst enemy. So from there, I move into user biases and how to mitigate them. But I want to skip to a part where we talk about stakeholder biases. So the middle section of this book that talks about stakeholder bias might as well be called How to Get Your Boss to Do Whatever You Want Whenever You Want. Part of this is every talk I go to, like no matter how good the talk, I can guarantee you one question is always going to be in the Q&A, and it's going to be some flavor of, what you said was great, but how do I get my boss to listen? Or how do I get my team to do this, right? So no matter what advice I give, if I can't help you understand how to mitigate your boss's biases to implement whatever that is, it might as well just be a book that sits on your shelf. So this next section is part of a larger section that really tries to get at what are the biases your stakeholders have, and not to be too Machiavellian about it, but how can you use that to your user's advantage? And this specifically is a section on what I call stakeholder inception. As you've probably learned by now, how you present is at least as important as what you present. I've consulted internally with teams that need to make a big presentation and presentation-driven enterprises, there are many, to understand how to tell the story in a way that appeals to the underlying problem a key stakeholder is trying to solve, rather than only in terms of the problem the team is trying to solve. In the end, it's almost like inception. Even better than convincing your stakeholder that your idea is right, because then it's still just your idea and will be easy to abandon when the going gets rough, is convincing them that your idea was their idea all along. A good way to do this is to give your stakeholders the tools and the framing to arrive at the conclusion on their own. I once had a client who had, out of habit, put some really valuable content behind a paywall. No matter how much we tried to explain that there was no real evidence that paywalling the content was generating real value, or that there was reason to believe the content could be much more impactful if it could be, or that there was reason to believe the content could be much more impactful if it could be shared, it always seemed culturally to be a closed subject. However, when we held an exercise where we got stakeholders to align on the goals for creating that content, and then presented from research user goals around reading that content, and then left it to the client to come up with a way to align those goals, they magically stumbled upon the idea of freeing up some of that content from behind the paywall. I'm glad they had that idea. The following section will give you more tools to incept your client, by which I mean artfully use one set of biases to combat another. I would never tell you to incept your client. That was your idea. Finally, I want to skip to the end and totally spoil the book. So the last section of the book really gets into what our job is and what we owe each other. So I'm going to read those sections now. What do you think your job is? The last bias I'd like to talk about is called déformation professionnelle. I told you I spoke French. It's a bias where you basically see the whole world through the lens of your job. This may seem like a good idea in the workaholic society we live in until people start getting hurt. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road probably thought they were doing a good job. They were, in fact, doing an incredible job. They were getting difficult to acquire shots that they knew would probably fetch them a hefty sum. What they were not doing a good job at was being human beings. Similarly, the bureaucrats who kept doing their job during the Nazi occupation of France were probably being fantastic bureaucrats, but their jobs were putting French citizens in harm's way on a daily basis. This may seem like an extreme example and a far cry from tech until you pick up a book called IBM and the Holocaust, the strategic alliance between Nazi Germany and America's most powerful corporation. And if you think that's all in the past, well, someone has to build the databases that decide which children will be ripped from their parents by family separation policies at the border. When retired Philadelphia Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey first took the job, he asked his officers a simple question. What do you think your job is? Many would answer to enforce the law. He would say that seemed a reasonable enough answer, but then he would ask them, what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights? This encompasses enforcing the law. I don't have very many civil rights if I'm being robbed or killed, but it's a higher mandate, a bigger job, a harder job. It gives the officer a mandate to treat people with dignity. Their jobs are harder than they think. but more than a mandate, it gives them permission to treat people with dignity. It's all too easy to define your job in a way that dehumanizes people to an extent that you don't fundamentally agree with. As we saw earlier, most people just need a reminder that human beings are, human, to give them a reason to step back from doing harm. Here, Ramsey was tying it into their very job description. Here, Déformation Professionnelle could actually help people. And I'm going to pause here just to sort of point something out. That story about Police Commissioner Ramsey, which I first heard about at a TEDx Philadelphia talk that he gave, has been in the talk since 2017. Remember when I was talking about like discovering the talk? Like that's when I discovered the talk, when I discovered its connection to Black Lives Matter. Obviously, that part of the talk has become tragically more relevant. I won't even say more relevant because Black people were being killed then too, more publicly relevant than it ever has been. And even this week, we see it isn't stopping. If anything, it's escalating. And lately, for obvious reasons, I have a lot of difficulty getting through that part. But, and I had a discussion with Cattell, our publisher, about whether or not to leave it in because we didn't want to make it seem like we were apologizing for the police or giving them an excuse for their behavior. But we agreed that the point of that section is that how we define our jobs is life or death. And the entire discussion around defund the police is a fundamental asking of the question, what is their job? What should it be? Should it be? But unless you answer the question of what should the police's job be, you never get out of that cycle. I just have to pause there because even now I'm getting very emotional about that section. But let me show you where that's going. What we owe each other. Our job as designers is not simply make cool shit. We have to find a way to define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human toward one another. This conversation comes at a crucial moment. Not long ago, I was speaking with Lullabot's senior architect, Greg Dunlap, about the current state of design. He commented that his father used to be a physicist. When Dunlap vented to his father about the toothless discussions he had been hearing about tech ethics, his father remarked, "Yeah, that reminds me of how the physics community was before the Manhattan Project." Now is the time for us to seek out and agree on a definition of designer that includes accountability to society. You'll find some of these attempts listed in the resource section. There's more, but I wanted to kind of stop there. So that hopefully gives you a flavor of the breadth and the specificity that the book gets into. I don't really have any more to say. We can get into the discussion and the questions and all, and that's going to be this next section.
Awesome. Well, before we do that, Dave, I'm going to turn off the spotlight. I'm going to encourage everyone, if you don't already have the grid view, the gallery view on Zoom, to turn that on. And if your camera isn't on for a moment, I'm going to ask you to consider doing so. You can leave your microphone off, but I want to invite you into something that a little indie hall tradition for when we do things like show and tell and other Zoom events. Since one of the things about everybody being on mute that Dave would miss out on compared to a real event is a round of applause. So at Indie Hall, we have a thing we call Zoom applause, and everybody can do it. It's just a little bit of spirit fingers. So I'm going to invite everybody to come on screen and give Dave a round of Zoom applause. And see, Dave, doesn't that feel really good?
That is pretty awesome, I gotta admit.
So I think it's the closest facsimile to a real applause we can give you. What an awesome book you made, my dude. I'm super proud of you.
I think I'm going to ask you all to come back every morning when I get up and do that. I think it'll really help me start my day. And I'll do it for you too. It's fair. I'll do it for you, but yeah.
But, and it's recorded, Dave. You can replay it anytime
there you go.
want. It's like,
that's what I'll do.
It's like 50 First Dates, which is actually like kind of a perfect segue into how I wanted to kick off our conversation, which might be surprising even to you, Dave. So when I think of Dave Thomas, I think of a few things. And one of the first ones that comes to mind is a passion and a geekdom for media. Movies, music, comic books, storytelling, more broad, basically any medium that can tell a story. Dave is one of the most knowledgeable people about it that I know. And if I have a question or I'm looking to vet something, or if Dave has vetted something, I instantly trust it. So the reason I provide that context is because I imagine, Dave, you're someone who thinks about media as a product a lot. And I'm wondering, I want to talk a little bit about what in your mind, the process of making a book was like. What did you imagine, even prior to the consideration of there is a book to be made? What did you think making a book was like? And then I want to sort of complement that with maybe, you know, a couple of unexpected lessons from the process, things that you learned along the way, things that popped up, how you learned them, who you learned them from. So yeah, the expectations, and then how did reality meet, exceed, break, or destroy those set expectations?
So for the longest time, anyone I know who's written a book, and you know, I'm privileged that many people I know now have written books, consistently would say, "Oh my God, it's the hardest thing I've ever done." So my expectation was, this is going to be the hardest thing I've ever done. Nobody I talked to had said, "Oh yeah, I wrote a book, it was easy." That was a breeze. So what was interesting was when I finally sat down to write it, the first draft, what I call the vomit draft, just get it all on the paper. It was easy. It was very, very easy. And the reason it was easy is because I had been thinking about this stuff for 3 years and structuring it in talks for 3 years. So literally the process of writing the book, the first draft, was open up the deck, look at the slide and start typing, go to the next slide, keep typing. Like I was doing something like 1,000 words a day because I wasn't creating anything. I was simply transcribing what was in my head when I gave those talks. So that part was easy. The part that was hard, that I didn't anticipate being hard, was one, and this is where having a brilliant editor like Lisa Maria comes in, was how she would challenge me, well, really on two things. One, on structure. Like that was the hard part, because structuring a talk and structuring a book are two very different things. You structure a talk in a sense to take an audience on a 1-hour journey, right? With highs and lows and sort of like, you know, like a symphony. A book is this far more structured thing where you have, you know, crystals within crystals, right? Everything sort of has a purpose and leads into the next thing and has relevance and justifies its own existence in this very rigid way. And there was a lot of bloodshed and things that are no-brainers for my talk that are like knockdown dragouts for whether it gets into the book. So understanding that those are two fundamentally different disciplines and creative forms that require different thoughts was a lesson. The other thing that Lisa Maria really pushed me on was like finding relevant examples and sourcing and evidence and just backing up what I was saying, which was great because I would sort of find that, so for example, there's a section where I talk about how if something rhymes or is easy to read, it seems more believable, more truthful. And I say the reason this matters is because, you know, health outcomes, for example, like we have a crisis in this country where African Americans don't believe health information that comes from the government, and they have very legit reasons for those concerns, but it's information that could save lives. So we need to consider rhyming, clear language, whatever's on the table. And she's like, that's a great theory, but like, can you back it up? Can you point to health outcomes that were impacted by rhyming, by these things? And I did. And it wouldn't have even occurred to me to really do that extra work unless she'd kind of pushed me on that. But the other thing I found in like the fact checking phase was that I have a terrible memory, which given that explicitly in the book, I talk about how terrible our memories are, I should have seen coming. But I would find like, oh, I remember this really cool example where someone like watched a video of themselves, like saying their name, and then like, they couldn't tell when they were lying, but their body could because they're hooked up to a galvanic skin response thing. And then when I tried to find that example, I realized I'd taken two completely separate studies and meshed them in my mind. And I'm like, wow, my memory's crap.
or everything really is a remix.
Yes. Like you get a respect for that, right? From a physiological level when you try to find out like, okay, that story I've been telling at cocktail parties, where did that come from? Right? When you start to have to do that work, you're like, oh yeah, I am I am not so smart, as the name of the podcast goes. So that was another big lesson, was just sort of understanding, yeah, I need to do better sourcing.
Wild. Yeah, but I mean, the research part of it, especially when you are, one of the things that impressed me a lot about the book was the volume of references. It's a book that I would feel comfortable describing to people as in a science category, in part because of all of the references, even though, as you said before, you are not an expert, but you are a super fan of a lot of these experts. The volume of references, the depth of them, and then pulling them all together with all of the stories and examples. Like I mentioned before, I feel like in some ways I've gotten to watch this book evolve even before the first talk, because we'd be having a conversation around a coffee table or a bar camp or something like that. And this is just kind of the way I feel like you've always communicated with people, is like, I read this cool story, or I watched this cool talk, you got to watch it. And it's like, you've always just kind of assembled more interesting than primary source examples to things that matter, but often people wouldn't care because the primary source is not interesting enough. So it's a combination of you finding the interestingness in them and helping get people excited about it, which I think you do brilliantly in the book. And you also find and platform other people who have done that for you, which I think is it's just a cool way to sort of have seen it all come together,
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, the way you put that, I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of like a walking radio lab. The tradition I'm coming out of, I think, is very much this Radiolab, Malcolm Gladwell, lateral thinking tradition. And and Stephen Johnson's another one. So I love the idea of connecting two seemingly unconnected things. It's like, there's a great joke where it's like, if you want to write a Malcolm Gladwell article, that your title is like, what blank can teach us about totally unrelated thing. Like that's the formula, right? But I love that stuff. And it's funny, like, as I try to think about like what new am I trying to bring to that, I think it is trying to be more thoughtful about power in those dynamics, or, I'm coming at it from a place, actually, it isn't super new. Radiolab has actually been pretty freaking woke for a while now, but trying to come at it from this place of like, well, yeah, but what does this mean for, the person on the street? What does this mean for people who don't have power?
Yeah.
Right? Who don't listen to Radiolab? Like
Totally,
that's the interesting place for me, is what happens when people get access to that tradition who have not traditionally had access to that tradition. That's kind of the place I'm interested in right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, what's interesting is like, you're interested in it right now, but also like that interest is not new. It's just, it's like, it's galvanized. You're better at articulating it. You have more practice, which actually is sort of one of the next things I want to dig into. Before I do though, I do want to remind folks that are here, in about 10 minutes or so, we're going to open up to questions. So if you have questions that you want to ask Dave about the book writing process, anything, I will let Dave defer to what he doesn't want to answer. But the best way to get your questions in, and we've got actually more time for Q&A than Dave and I are going to talk. That was Dave's call, and I totally agree. He wants to talk with you. He wants to answer your questions. So get those questions into the chat. Sorry, Spotlight here's a little wacky. Get those questions into the chat right now, and if you preface them with text, I will read them for you. If you preface them with video, when it's your turn, I will invite you to turn on your video, your microphone, and you can ask Dave directly. Going back to what I was talking about before, about you've been developing sort of your articulation of these ideas over time. And actually one of the lessons in the book I just published is about repetition. And how I have this firm belief that a lot of I think repetition is undervalued, and that a lot of success can actually be chalked up to being willing to repeat yourself. And you're one of a few people that I know personally who has talks on the shelf that you've given repeatedly, which I've always found fascinating. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what it feels like to repeat yourself as a big part of your career, and what you think repetition has provided you. And then maybe a follow-on part to that is like, what tool do you think or hope the book will give you in terms of being able to just be like, all right, I've said that part and now I wrote it down. Can I now repeat some new stuff? Like, how are you thinking about that?
Over the past few years, I've become very conscious of the link between how I do talks and a lot of people do talks and stand-up comedy. That you have a routine, right? That you do, and you hone that routine over time. And maybe it starts out as like just a few 10 minutes that you try out at a club. And here, the equivalent of a club would be something like bar camp. So bar camp, for those of you who don't know, well, it happens a lot of places. The Philadelphia version is one that I've helped organize actually with a couple of people on the call right now. But the basic idea is you show up in the morning and there's a big board with a bunch of rooms and a bunch of times. And you basically have a bunch of blank cards and you write down, hey, I want to talk about knitting. And you slap that up, at a certain room at a certain time. Or I want to talk about JavaScript and slap that up in a certain room at a certain time. And within, honestly, about 30 minutes, the whole thing fills up and there's your day. It becomes this great place to try out new material and sort of see if a talk is resonating and whatnot. But that's how I tend to think about it. And very much like a stand-up routine, like it evolves and it morphs and it relies upon audience interaction to get its life. And I'll be honest, like my talks do tend to skew humorous. I am looking for laughs consciously, and I, from a technique standpoint, I think very much about, the craft of tempo. For example, I study John Mulaney intensely. John Mulaney is, beyond a great comedian, is a great orator. Like, I have watched his frickin' specials on Netflix 10, 20 times. I still laugh. I know the joke. That's not what's making me laugh. It's his delivery. It's his movement. It's his precision. And if you watch them, you can see him get better. You can see him honing his craft from special to special. So he's one of the people I actually look up to when I think about giving talks. Like Mulaney is, I'm a student of his work. So rhythm, volume, like all those things. And repetition allows me to get better at that and sort of play with, okay, well, what if I change the way I say this time or that time? The other thing, honestly, it gives me is capacity. So this fall, I'm going to be giving very many talks. And a lot of them are just going to be variations on the Design for Cognitive Bias talk. And what having that down so pat gives me, that repetition gives me, is the ability to do that multiple times a week without having to burn out, frankly. And be able to focus more time on the Q&A section, where that's where, to me, things get interesting, is because that's the unpredictable part. It's like, I've given you the same inputs that I gave this other group, but I don't know what you're going to do with them. I don't know what you're going to focus in on, right? So that repetition just allows me to kind of like treat it like a craft and forget about the talk and focus on the audience. Like, I think that's the best thing I get out of it. From an evolution of ideas standpoint, it's funny you say that, because, I'm promoting the book now. And for new places, I can just rely on like Design for Cognitive Bias talk, or I have a civil discourse talk, like that's in my repertoire. But for places I've already given those talks, I need new material. So like Confab, South by, like there are places where I'm like, oh, I've already given them all my talks. I need new shit. So I'm actually that middle part where I'm talking about stakeholder bias and organizational bias and like how to pitch your ideas. Like that's going to be the new talk. Like I'm going to build a talk that's basically around like why your boss won't listen to you. And like, cause I figure like I was saying, every single Q&A, somebody's asking, how do I convince my boss of this? So I'm just going to have a talk that's called how to convince your boss of anything. And like, that'll be it.
Well, I'm going to do something that I don't often do in front of a group this large. And I'm going to give a little bit of business advice that was unsolicited, which is that's not just a talk. That's not just a book. That is a very high value product, whether that is, a workshop or something more robust and interactive. I'm very excited to hear that is one of the next things you're evolving, because, well, for a lot of reasons, some of which I think are obvious. But I think what's interesting about it, and hearing you say it makes sense to me, because nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, gosh, I would love to know more about cognitive bias today, except Dave Dillon Thomas, who absolutely does, and perhaps some folks in this room. But there are a lot of people who wake up in the morning and go, I got to get my boss to listen to me today. And last time I tried, it didn't work. Or I'm afraid to even try it all because my last boss didn't listen. So, in terms of I'm excited for you for a lot of reasons, but that excites me so much because the realm of impact for that is so interesting, because I think it's the kind of thing that I think Design for Cognitive Bias as a book is something that a practitioner will pick up and you will make them better for it. And I think your book, this is true, I think of all the A Book Apart books, they are designed for practitioners to build better craftspeople. I've always thought that was true, and that's why this book fits in that pantheon. I think the ability to evolve this in that direction, where it's not just the practitioner, but it's the worker who does not yet consider themselves a practitioner because they don't see the work as a practice, but they just see the work as the pain that they deal with in their workplace. I think everyone's experienced it, and plenty of people have experienced it far more than others. So that's really, really cool.
Yeah, and I will shamelessly plug. I am now, well, Think is now rolling out an inclusive design workshop, and the middle section of that workshop is sort of the prototype for what I'm telling you about, this new talk focused on stakeholder bias. So if anyone out there needs inclusive design help, yeah, I'm here. But yeah, I'm excited about that too. And just thinking about, like, that's the new material, right? Yeah. Like that's my next routine that I'm like shopping on and getting on the road.
That's fantastic. Cool. Well, we've got some amazing questions coming in. I want to get to those in just a minute. I've got like one last question or thing for us to talk about for a couple of minutes, which is, what is something that, you know, people, I imagine you're getting asked a lot of questions about cognitive bias, not just the book, but, you know, this now area. What's something that you really want to talk about that is not what people are asking you about? Like, what are you jazzed about when you're not being asked about cognitive bias?
That is an interesting question. I mean, where I'm trying to get people to go is to start thinking about power. I'm closing a lot of my talks now with support Black businesses, right? Brianna, one of our colleagues, helped work on a website called rebuildblackbusiness.com, which gives you over 14,000 different Black businesses you could be supporting right now. So don't tell me you can't find one. But really steering this conversation toward value. I mean, I keep thinking, like, if I were to write another book, what would it be called? It would be about value and all the different ways to think about value, because I think that's at the core of a lot of inequality we see today. Value of lives, value of jobs, like how we're defining value, I think is informing a lot of these things. And so I find myself steering the conversation inexorably toward capitalism, inexorably towards economics and white supremacy. And it's not just me. Like, if anyone who went to Design and Content Conference this year knows that every other talk wasn't just abstractly about white supremacy, but no, literally they said the words white supremacy 2 or 3 times, right? It is no longer just this political thing. It is a practice thing. It is a personal thing. So that's really, and not for nothing, I don't think it's a coincidence. The book is, I always hoped the book would do well, but I think the timing is not a coincidence, that this is a thing we are thinking about more broadly than design right now. And there's a lot of heat on it. So that's kind of where I'm trying to, I wouldn't even say trying to, like, I don't see an alternative. Like, the conversation has, if we keep talking long enough, we're going to talk about capitalism. We're going to talk about sex and race. We're going to talk about white supremacy. Like, it's just, we can't not, you know? So that's kind of where these things are headed for me.
Cool. I think that's an important place for these things to be headed. I'm glad that you've got a range of topics here that are really a kind of amazing bait to get the fish on the hook. And if you've got a fish on the hook and that's where you take them, then I'm even more excited for this work and the things to come. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for making an awesome book, and thank you for continuing this work.
Thank you.
We're going to switch over to audience Q&A, if that's cool with you.
Oh yeah.
Awesome. Also, before we do that, just want to say, hey, thank you for being here. There are almost 100 people from around the world on this call right now, and I just think that's pretty amazing. I wanted to say that out loud. So we're going to get the first question in from, is it David Featherstone Huff? Did I get that right?
Yeah, pretty close. David Featherstone Huff. Yes.
Awesome. Well, David, if you would like to ask your question, go ahead and turn on your audio, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Okay. David, I'm super glad you've written this book, and I'm very excited to read it. I have not read it yet. So my question is just to pull from a couple of things you said in your opening remarks. At the beginning, you said you'd kind of discovered along the way that this book is actually at its core about the ethics of design. And then later on, when you were reading in the introduction, it referred to a chapter in the book that'll basically help readers make their ideas, their boss's ideas, kind of outside the awareness of their boss. And I'm a behavioral economist, designer as well. And I continually struggle with the power of being able to essentially manipulate people's decisions outside their awareness. It gives me the power to impose my values on them. And how do I reconcile this thing that feels like a conundrum between, designing ethically, then also being an expert manipulator because of my expertise? I feel that as an ethical tension, and I'd love to know your thoughts on it, if you see it that way, and if so, how you deal with it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I had a similar discussion at UX Copenhagen at the very conference where I kind of premiered that talk. I was on a Tech for Good live podcast with these amazing folks, Johnny Ravens and Rebecca Ray Evans. And we were talking about dark patterns and this, how do you know when you see one, right? Because some are obvious, but some are like, it's a gray pattern. I don't know. Because based on this notion of, if I am guiding you, if I'm designing in a way that guides you to a particular decision, in a way that you may not be aware that the design is guiding you there, is that ethical? And one of the tests we came up with, or at least conjectured, was if you are willing to disclose your methodology. In other words, if you're willing to say, the reason I chose red for this background is because I wanted to make you angry, or the reason that I put a suitcase in this, or a backpack in this room instead of a briefcase, is because I knew a briefcase would make you competitive. If you're willing to disclose that, or even if you literally want like an open source, you can click on a website and see the code. If you're willing to do that, then maybe it's not that dark. If on the other hand, you feel maybe a little ashamed, right, of the tricks you're using, maybe it's gray at least, right? So that's one. I think with all things, we need a set of questions to ask ourselves, to check ourselves in those scenarios, because I think you're absolutely right. I think the other thing we need to keep in mind is you're never not manipulating. Like, we are humans. Anything I do, the way I'm moving my hands right now, your mind is coming up with a reason for why I'm moving my hands this way. And all I can do with that information is decide whether or not to be intentional about how I move my hands, right? What I can't do is keep you from interpreting what I'm doing and coming to conclusions about that below the threshold of conscious thought. I can't turn that off. It would be kind of weird if I could. So that I think, basically you're stuck with the ethical dilemma, no matter what. Whether you intentionally try to manipulate or whether you try not to manipulate, you are going to manipulate, or probably a better way to put it is you are going to influence. You have no choice, because humans are pattern-making machines. And by the way, you too are going to interpret. You have no choice about that. You have some choice in recognizing when that's happening. But I think you have to, like, table stakes understand there's no way out of that ethical dilemma. It's really a question of saying, okay, well, I'm gonna need to set up some ethical guardrails to make sure that this communication is always weighted toward the good, but it's never not gonna be weighted. I think you're on mute, Alex.
Yeah, I muted myself. Welcome to 2020, everybody, where the host mutes himself. Larry Swanson's got the next question. I'm going to read it for him. Larry asked, he's wondering if there's anything that occurred to you since the book went to press that you wish you could add now.
Every day. Oh my God. What? Okay, so Project Inkblot, which has been around for years, I only just found out about, and they're doing amazing work in inclusive design. I just found out, oh my God, Larry might have told me about this. Somebody told me about this recently. There's a website that basically takes resumes and, not resumes, like job descriptions and internal communications, and like points out, hey, you're asking for the name of the college here. That could sway you in a way that's actually biased, right? Like automates that shit. So the resources I'm finding out about, I'll tell you the one that really, and Cattell, this will make you mad too. So there's a part of the book where I talk about Instagram. There's a whole section of the book where I challenge the idea that a designer's job is the artful reveal of information, and say basically, hey, you need to be thinking about, you need to think just as hard about what information you need to conceal, because sometimes that concealing that information can produce a less biased experience for your user. So one of the examples I point to is how Instagram is starting to remove likes from your feed. So you can see how many likes you got, but you can't see how many likes other people got. And the intention, as far as we can tell, because Instagram hasn't said anything, the intention appears to be better, you know, among other things, better mental health, right? I'm not going to be constantly comparing myself to other people and see, like, if I don't know how many likes they got, I can't compare that to how many likes I've got, right? Like 2-3 weeks ago, frickin' CEO of Instagram says, this is why we did that. And now that quote's in my talk, but it ain't in the book. And I can't tell you how many times we tried to reach out to Instagram to get one person to say, yeah, this is why we're doing this, or this is how we're measuring the success of that initiative. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm putting a physical thing out into the world when most of your work is digital. Like the print thing is final. I'm learning things about that with my book as well.
Yeah, we're gonna have a whole other Zoom call about your Amazon adventures sometime.
If anybody's interested in the adventures of self-publishing or just working in publishing in general, it is the things that freak you out about publishing are not the things that should freak you out about publishing. I'll put it that way. I've got a question from Lou Hockman. Lou, do you want to come on screen and ask your question?
Mine was very similar ground to David's, and I very much like the answer, especially disclosure as an ethical benchmark. So you can move on from me.
Cool, great.
Hello.
Awesome. Sabina is up next. Oops, I scrolled and lost it. Sabina, you want to unmute yourself and come on?
Yeah, so I was very interested in the part where you talked about the references and, you know, all the fact checking type of stuff. I think that is so fascinating. It's not what I do for work, but I find it very fascinating. I'm interested to learn more about just your general research process and like, where do you start? And I know that this has been like a passion area for you for quite some time, but you know, where does one start with this type of thing? And then also how have you fought and how do you recommend that other people fight the sort of like, I don't know what I don't know problem in researching this type of stuff?
So for me, after I saw that talk by Iris Bonet, I went to the Rational Wiki and found their page of cognitive biases. It's like 100, 150 just individual biases listed out. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get through all this in a day. So I just would take one bias a day and I literally would just Google it. And whatever the first 3 or so results were, I would just sort of research and read and try to catch up on. And that was what turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias, which is what led Emily to say, oh my God, just get a podcast already. In doing the podcast, like seriously, if you want to learn something, do a podcast about it. Because when you have to explain it to someone, it forces you to learn it better. So that actually, that would be my recommendation for a fairly cheap, sorry, I need to power. A fairly cheap way to learn something. So as far as the fact-checking part, in season 1, I would just sort of like make these little notes to myself of like, okay, I found this cool thing out, I found that cool thing out, and then I talk about it on the podcast and move on. Around season 2, a friend of mine reached out and was like, I'd really love it if you could like cite your sources, like put down your references. And I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. And so I started creating show notes on Facebook where every time I was like literally referencing a specific study, I would just link to that study. And I'm so glad I did, because writing this book, when I'm literally listening to old episodes and pulling references, I hated season 1 because I would pull this thing and I have to go back and be like, why did I think that was true? Crap, I have to find, whereas season 2, it was all there and I could just look in the show notes and be like, oh, that's where the like Thank you, past Dave. Fuck you, season 1, Dave. But that was how I got into that habit, which is still not a perfect habit. I'll still write talks and be like, wait, where the crap did that come from? But that's how I approach that. I wasn't sure what the second part of your question was.
The second part is about, sort of the fighting, not knowing what you don't know problem.
Oh.
And, again, you started with somebody else has compiled this big, long list of resources. And so you just assume that that's a conclusive or hopefully full, relatively complete list. But if you don't have the benefit of a 150-point list, like where do you even go from there?
The answer is other people. So
yeah.
You know how if you say on Facebook once, I really like strawberries, and then all of a sudden for your birthday, just people start giving you strawberry shit. That's kind of how like life works. If you just start hyper focusing on one topic, you find that people are like, oh, hey, have you seen this chart? Oh, hey, have you seen this thing? Or you'll have this hyper awareness around it. So you'll notice someone bring up some tool in a talk that you're like, oh my God, that's amazing. And really your best friend there is just having a common repository, whether it's a Google Doc or a slide deck that you're working on or whatever, just be like, oh, I got to grab that shit and throw it in there. And then I can go back later and find it. So like a lot of the examples in the book are from just like resources I had just compiled and thrown into a pile somewhere to say like, oh, I got to go back to that later. Like there's a section where I talk about AI bias, and there's a deck I've been working on. That's basically the deck I'm rolling out. It starts out talking about moral hazard of gameplay in AI programming. And so anytime I would hear an example of someone doing some stupid shit with AI and getting a really crazy result, I would like throw that into that deck. So when it came time to talk about in the book, I just say, oh, let's see, let me find the weirdest example from the deck. Oh, here's one, and just throw it in. So that's another habit. Jerry McGovern actually taught me that habit. Whenever he's working on a talk, he'll just open up like a Google slide or whatever, like a slide deck, and just start throwing in slides just before he even has a shape to it. Just he has an interest, and he'll just throw any examples that tie into that right into that deck. And like, it's some of the best advice I ever got.
Awesome. That's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Sweet. Thanks, Sabina. I've got a question from Don Wade. Asks, what are some examples of biased designs you've seen in the wild? And maybe more specifically, if you can think of like a common repeat offender that companies or brands are executing in design bias, which I know that design bias means, that's a very broad category. So I'll let you narrow that however you like, Dave.
So the example I like to go to is Amazon, and Alex, I know you'll appreciate this. But the reason I go to it is because I can give you a really good example and a really bad example, neither of which are intentional. I think that's what's important to keep in mind here is there's plenty of design that is intentionally fucked up, but the vast, like the 80-20 rule of that is like it's 80%, I had no idea what I was doing. So the Amazon examples I give are biased hiring. So they created an AI that was going to help them hire people, and it kept recommending dudes. And when they looked at what they trained the AI on, it was the past 10 years of resumes. Guess what many of those resumes had in common, right? Mostly men. So the AI took one look at that and said, I guess you really like guys, and just kept recommending guys. They didn't wake up one morning and say, oh, you know what we should have? A really super sexist hiring bot. They just said, oh, I think we should create a hiring bot because bots are cool. What should we train it on? I don't know. Throw a bunch of resumes at it. Great idea, right? Now, on the other end of the spectrum, they created this less biased shopping experience in the Amazon Go stores. And the way they did it was the way Amazon Go works fundamentally is you walk into the store, you take what you want, and you leave because Amazon is going to automagically deduct all that from your account. So you don't really interact with people. Well, there's this phenomenon known as shopping while black, which manifests as hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? There's no one in Amazon Go to do that. They removed the key design element, other people, and created a less biased shopping experience. Ashley Clark Thompson wrote an article for CNET called like, when I'm shopping at Amazon Go, no one knows I'm black. And again, they didn't wake up one morning and say, you know how we can create a less biased shopping experience? It's like, no, they were just trying to be cool, right? They're just trying to take over brick and mortar. But oops, we made something less biased. So honestly, a lot of the project of the book is to say, okay, if we can create more biased or less biased experiences by accident, surely we can do it on purpose. But Amazon is a great one to go to because they're so freaking big, they can't help but do both unintentionally because the scale they're operating at. I mean, Facebook is another one. Like anytime you get people doing social science experiments at scale, you are going to get a shit ton of unintentional bias and occasionally unintentional like debiasing.
Awesome. I've got a question from Sarah Feldman. Sarah, do you want to unmute yourself and come on and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, my question is, I'm curious if there's anything that did not make it into your book that was especially difficult for you to leave out. And unlike the Instagram example, I'm curious if in this case it was something you could have included but weren't able to for other reasons.
So I don't know if Lisa Maria is on the call, but oh my God, we went back and forth up until the very last version on this concept of evidentiality. And by the way, this text more or less still exists in some blog post I did once, but there's a part of the book where I start getting into this idea of what's believable and not believable based on text. It originally was going to be in the there's a section of the book on notational bias, which is really about how our own biases can leak into how we structure and write content. And there's a section where I talk about this concept called evidentiality. And evidentiality is something that other languages have, but English doesn't. And it's basically has to do with how we use our verb tense. So English is very basic in how we use verb tense. It just tells you when something happens. Bob went to the store. Bob is going to the store. Bob will go to the store. There are other languages like Turkish, which make their verb tenses do more heavy lifting. And those verb tenses tell you how I know that Bob went to the store. So there's one verb tense for I saw Bob go to the store. There is a verb tense for somebody told me Bob went to the store. And there's a whole other verb tense for like, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. And I fell in love with the idea that, oh my God, how would that influence what you're willing to post online if you were on the hook for how you knew it? Because you literally can't say Bob went to the store without also saying how you know. And so I had this notion that, well, we know that the more readable something is, the more believable it is, and the harder it is to read, the less believable it is. So what if I have an article and the parts of the article that have confirmable facts are written in this very clear font, and the parts that are a little more fuzzy, it's like, well, there's a rumor that this and maybe that and conjecture that are kind of grayed out and are therefore literally less believable. And I just love that idea. But here's the thing. It's an idea. Like, I don't have any evidence. I don't have any example to point to in the wild where, oh yeah, the New York Times did this, or oh yeah, this other person. And you'll notice most of the examples in the book, I can point to a thing and say, this person did that. Here's what happened, right? Here's a bias that there's actually a study that says this happens. And here's some examples of design doing that thing. There's not a lot of, wouldn't it be neat if? And believe me, I am a big believer in wouldn't it be neat if? But that's one of those things that, given the brand and given the type of book this is, makes sense for a talk, but don't make sense for a book. But I held on to that so tight for so long. And I was like, well, what if we move to this section? Or wait, I could come up with some examples that weren't really good examples. And like, so I was, but that was the last domino to fall. That still hurt to not be able to quite, but it's still in the talk, so I feel okay.
Nice. I guess that is the nice thing is like you've got the book as your primary source, but you do have talks and promotion stuff. So you can work that stuff in, continue workshopping things and things like that.
Yeah. But please steal my idea and see if it is true so I can put it in the next book.
Somebody do a large scale experiment for Dave, please. I've got a question from David Just. If you want to unmute yourself and come on and ask, that'd be awesome.
Hi. So since no one is without bias, and I'm curious, and as long as it's not too personal to ask this kind of question, I was curious, and I don't know if you touch upon this in the book, which I haven't gotten to yet, but I'm curious, what kinds of biases have you noticed in your own life in the past and or present, and since you began studying this field, how have some of those biases changed, if at all?
Oh, dear Lord, they haven't changed. So one of the things you discover very quickly when you study bias is that you can't change them. Like one of the things I talk about in the book is that even if you know about the bias, you still do it. I don't mention this in the book, but even if you're really smart, like people who have high IQs are sometimes more susceptible to certain biases. So it's not something you cure. Now, long-term, you can work on it, but in terms of like, oh, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and bias be gone. No, that doesn't work that way. So to answer your question, yes, there is definitely a bias I think I'm particularly prone to, and it's called zero risk bias. And there's, I think the first season finale of the podcast, actually, I do a whole episode about this if you want more detail, but the zero risk bias basically states that I would go to unreasonable lengths to be sure something could never happen. So much so that I'm actually making it worse. So an example might be that, I think it was in the 60s, there was a big scare for obvious reasons around carcinogens in food. And so they decided to pass a law that basically said no food can have any carcinogens whatsoever. And this might seem like a reasonable thing to do until you realize, okay, some of the things they got rid of had like a 0.0001% chance of causing cancer. And in order to still produce the food, they had to replace it with stuff that had a 2 or 3% chance of causing heart disease. Mm. So in wanting to completely eradicate to an absurd extent the risk of something happening, they actually created something worse. I totally get this bias. I feel seen. I like not having to think about stuff and have stuff so great. And so the example I give in the episode is Joss Whedon. So it's complicated now, but I was a huge Joss Whedon fan. So much so, and my wife too. Like it's one of the things we bonded over when we first met. We like watched all of Buffy. So much so that my son's middle name is Joss, Kieran Joss Thomas.
All right.
It's not the only reason, but it's a big one. And not too long ago, it came out that Joss Whedon had been cheating on his wife. And that may not sound like that big a deal given all the controversies around, but you know, Joss Whedon's a pretty pronounced feminist. So it wasn't a super feministy thing for him to do. And there's a lot of canceling of Joss Whedon at the time. And I was thrown into a tizzy around, you know what, like part of my brain wanted to be like, oh my God, let me burn all of my Buffy DVDs, right? Like that's the only way. And another part of my brain's like, no, like I still believe in him, but oh my God, now I'm being put in a position of defending an anti-feminist. I can't do that. So I got to burn all the DVDs. Like, but it had to be one or the other. There was no room for, I guess you have to have a complicated relationship with pop culture. Like that was not an option, right? It was kill Joss or love Joss. That was it, because zero risk bias. Like I wanted to never, ever possibly have to be challenged about watching Buffy, right? That's what was really going on there. So yeah, that's something I'm totally guilty of. That's something I recognize in myself. And it allows me at least the moment to step back and see, maybe I'm being a little zero risk bias right now, right? But it's still there. That's still the gut reaction. And really then it becomes, okay, well, what do I do with that gut reaction? But the gut reaction doesn't go away. I'm still a big zero risk bias guy.
Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
That's great.
I've got a question from Rita about machine learning and artificial intelligence, asking what we can do, if anything at all, to prevent the models that we're designing from amplifying the human cognitive biases that we all have and can't, as you said, avoid or cure. Is it even possible with the amount of data that we have to create unbiased or less biased models and the cognitive impact that it has on people?
So I'm going to give a very flip answer and then explain. So the flip answer is let poor people design them. The more nuanced answer is to say that usually what you find is that we don't ask why we want to know things. We more often than not, try to figure out what can we know and then try to reverse engineer something to do with that information. Which leads to a lot of waste. It leads to a lot of moral hazard of gameplay. Moral hazard of gameplay is basically a mismatch between what you want to happen, what you're incentivizing. And basic example would be school. You want people to learn, but you incentivize getting A's. problem is you can get A's without learning. So a better model might be something like project-based learning, where it's like, okay, we're going to build a car because I want you to learn engineering. You can't really build the car without learning engineering. So if the car works, okay, you probably did learn engineering. So we do this with AI all the time. And we have to decide what it is we want AI to do. The thing we don't get about AI, and I'm going to recommend Meredith Broussard's Artificial Unintelligence, which is a brilliant book on this topic. But she lays out, she demythologizes, takes away the mythology, takes the piss out of AI. Because AI is not her or Skynet. Like we think of general AI as this sort of like, oh, it's like a human, but more powerful. AI, like real life AI, is a prediction machine. It's something we use to scale predictions and make predictions. And we say, hey, AI, here's how we decide who to hire. Let me show you a bunch of information and a bunch of attributes and data we know about these people. And then I'm going to show you a bunch of people who are successful in that job and make those associations. Okay, now I'm going to show you a bunch of people you haven't seen yet. And I want you to predict who's going to be good at that job, because I already showed you who was good from that first set of data. Now I'm going to give you a new set of data. Predict who's going to be good, right? If that first set of data only has things like, well, they're a dude because it's mostly dudes and they all went to college, the AI is going to think, oh, well, obviously they need to be dudes and they need to go to college, right? We do a lot of pointing AI at a sexist, racist world, but then ask it to make non-sexist, non-racist predictions, because the mythology of AI is that, well, if it's doing the predictions, they can't possibly be biased because it's a robot and robots don't have feelings. Like we think AI is like Spock or Data, like, like this, you know, cold, unfeeling, perfectly rational thing. No, it's just a prediction engine. You're telling it to make some statistical connections and it's going to do it based on what you give it. So I very much, and I'm not the only one, like actual AI folks are starting to like resonate with this. We should just straight up be lying to AI. Like if you want AI to make non-racist predictions, you need to start telling it that Black families are more likely to get housing loans. You need to tell it that women are more likely to be scientists, right? But if you point it at the world we've got now and say, hey, take a look at this giant photo set and make some associations, it will and has said that women belong in the kitchen. It will literally make that association. Why? Because most of the photos out there of kitchens have women in them. So that to me, if you're asking like how to fix AI, it's very much a matter of, the reason I gave that first flip answer is it's a shortcut to getting there, right? If you have people who have been disempowered by AI doing the programming, they're going to make some different choices about the predictions they're going to ask it to make and how they're going to ask it to make those predictions. I'll give you one last example. Compass. Compass is software that's meant to predict who is going to who's going to be a recidivist, right? I've got someone, should I let them back on the street or not? How likely are they to commit a crime again? People with exactly the same crimes and exactly the same record, like almost precisely, but one of them's Black and one of them's white. The white guy would almost always be given a higher score as like, hey, you're safer to let this guy out on the street. And the Black guy is like, no, keep him in jail. Now, if you do a little bit of digging, the way that that Compass was making this prediction was based on surveys that they would put out that correlated to higher rates of recidivism. The questions on the survey were things like, has anyone in your family ever been to jail? How much crime is there in your neighborhood, right? And anybody who's lived a day knows that each of those questions are code for, are you Black? So without explicitly saying to the computer, if they're Black, give them a high score, they're 2 steps away from saying to the computer, if they're Black, give them a higher score. If someone who lived in one of those neighborhoods wrote that algorithm, or more to the point, wrote that survey, I can bet you dollars to donuts that the Compass would have started making different decisions. So that to me is how you fix AI, is fix the programmers.
Got one last question before we change gears. Thanks again to everybody who's sticking around with us. we've got almost 80 people still on the call, which is super, super cool. Martin Ficazio, you're going to be my last question. If you are still here, you are still here. You want to unmute yourself and come on and ask Dave your question?
Sure. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Marty, how you been?
Been ages, man. Good to see your face in real life, sort of, almost. So you've covered a lot of my questions. Hang on a second. Let me just phrase it exactly as I said it, because I'm scrolling back to make sure. There's a bias in access to truth, and it's increasing. There's you have to buy your way to facts. I think we're designing a biased media landscape, more so every day. I mean, I've bizarrely gone back to college, and I'm doing a degree program now, and I pay thousands of dollars for access to JSTOR and all this other stuff, peer reviewed, fact checked. You know, I know it's good, or I can Google it. And is there anything, I mean, you've talked about capitalism, and is this just the price of capitalism, that the information haves and haves nots, or the purity or quality of information is just as by design for keeping people stupid?
This is a very big question. So the first thing I want to touch on is that JSTOR shit. So
oh, I hate that. I hate it. I hate it.
All right. So full disclosure, like dirty little secret.
Yeah.
Many of the studies that I cite, unless you have access to JSTOR, you're not going to really be able to read. Right. And I hate that.
I go to the study authors themselves directly. I try to email them and say, give it to me for free. And they're always like, yeah, fuck off.
Yeah, it's fucked up. It's fucked up that you're going to read this book and you're going to see a study I reference, and unless you're willing to pay a shit ton of money, you are not going to be able to confirm it. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, I can't not say this. I can't pretend somebody didn't find this out and say that this is something you can apply to your work. At the same time, it sucks that I can't let you dig deeper. Right. Hell, I can't dig deeper in some cases. I can maybe read the abstract and be like, okay, it sounds like that's what they were saying. So in that sense, absolutely. And I haven't yet talked to an academician or whatever who doesn't think that that's going to burn down. Like that is such a short-sighted, unrealistic in this day and age. Like in some cases for reasons I can't say, that is not going to last long. People in that business see the writing on the wall, but they have no idea what to do. So that's one aspect. That is a very blunt aspect of the access to knowledge thing. I think, and we still haven't figured this out yet, the paradox of the internet is that it democratizes knowledge, but it does not democratize the ability to vet knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I first saw the bright new promise of the internet. I was an internet optimist, right?
Yeah. I remember.
and when Bruce Sterling was like, "You're all a bunch of idiots," I was like, "It's gonna be fine, Bruce. It's gonna be. You're a curmudgeon, Bruce. It's gonna be fine." And within 10 years, we were like, "Oh shit." Yeah. he saw it coming. The good news, by the way, is he also sees the end of Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple coming too. So, but what I didn't see coming, and in retrospect, I don't know why, is knowledge tribes.
Right.
That was the thing. I don't know how. It was, in retrospect, it was fucking obvious. And basically, knowledge tribes for the who's who at home is the idea that rather than have an affinity around I love the Eagles or around I love Jay-Z, it's going to be around QAnon. It's going to be around, it's actually not super far off from, and this was something else he pointed out early on. Bruce Sterling is a guy who gives the closing keynote at South by Southwest every year, for those of you who don't know. And he always has this apocalyptic, increasingly correct vision of the world. And one of the things he was talking about, I'd say almost 20 years ago at this point, is this thing that was popping up on the web called peer-to-peer commons-based production. Right? And it was this new concept that rather than big industry making stuff, individuals could collaboratively get together and make stuff with 3D printers and whatever, but it's going to be ground up, not top down, right? Look at Shenzhen in China. Like that's like, you know, he said, okay, this is neat, right? But you know what else is commons-based peer-to-peer production? Al-Qaeda.
That's right. That's
and we were like, oh shit, he's right, which would eventually turn into ISIS, right? So think about that: decentralized, yet very potent.
Yeah.
And what they're forming around is not a single leader. What they're forming around is a concept and a means to commit that concept. And now all of a sudden we've got QAnon, and we've got the what the hell are they called? Any number of the manist organizations out there, right?
Yeah.
Any number of neo-Nazi organizations in the States, right? Where it's not like, oh, there's this one leader. Well, Trump's kind of the de facto leader, but they're sort of like independently organized around concepts of knowledge and how you agree that knowledge exists.
Right.
The internet has made this possible, or easy. It was always kind of happening. So where capitalism runs into that, I think, is the platforms we have now are economically incentivized to do that, or really to do nothing about that, right? The incentive you have if you are working at YouTube is to increase engagement. That is the metric where you are going to get your bonus if your engagement numbers go up. How can I keep you engaged? By showing you increasingly radical shit. Whether it's because you're already radical or because, oh, you're bored, let me show you something even crazier, right? The business model is incentivizing this thing, going back to moral hazard of gameplay, incentivizing this thing that ultimately really isn't great for society, right? But that to me is where I'm seeing the intersection between knowledge tribes, which I think are decaying of the kind of vetted knowledge I think you're trying to get at, versus some balance between, I want my knowledge vetted, but I don't want to have to pay an arm and a leg for it.
Okay, so just to pull it all back home, Dave,
yeah, it's
appreciate
a big question.
I know it's a big question. That's why I'm glad you took it. The thing that I admit, I've put your book onto my Remarkable tablet, and so I can annotate the hell out of it. The concern I have about bias, and I have been hit in the face with my own bias repeatedly in the last 36 months especially, okay, by others. I've gotten a lot more people right up into my face about bias and facts and knowledge. But what the response I've had in many cases is, look, these are the facts as peer reviewed, and I've studied primary sources and stuff like that, and they can't always read the same primary sources and have a logical debate with me, because these sources are available to me because I have a .edu email address now, and they don't. And that's fucking bad.
So
I just give them the stuff. I just give them the stuff. I commit copyright violation. Here's the report. You can have it. But anyway, we can go on and on, but I don't
let me make one last point of that, because this is, all right, let's get to the sad truth.
Yes.
What science tells us is that even if you could give them access to those same primary sources for free,
I know.
the odds are it wouldn't make a difference. So I'm going to recommend a very depressing talk to all of you, which I've been recommending to people for years now. It's by Dana Boyd, and it's called What Hath We Wrought? She gave it at South by Southwest EDU, I think 2 years ago. Her basic premise is that we have two different ways in this country of answering the question, how do you know what you know? There's one tradition, it's a Western tradition around evidence and experience that says, I know what I know because people smarter than me have studied it, peer-reviewed it, and proven it. And if I want to go back and try the same shit myself, I can get the same results and say, yes, this is true. It is facts-driven and agrees on what a fact is.
It's bookmarked. I just copied my bookmark right into the chat.
There is another tradition that is based on gut that says, hey, that expert, how do I know they aren't being paid for? How do, in fact, and to be fair, they can point to lots of examples of people who have been bought and paid for and say, you know what, I don't trust that authority. I don't trust that. I'm going to go with the voices that I trust and what my gut tells me. There's deep evangelical roots there where I'm not going to take everything Trump says literally and say that it makes no point to fact check Trump. He's talking metaphorically like a preacher. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go with my gut, with what I believe, with who I trust. And if Fox News says it's true, then it's true. right? Not because I'm going to go to their secondary or primary source and say, well, why does Fox News thinks that? Why does Fox News believe that's true? I don't give a fuck. Fox News said it, it's okay. Glenn Beck said it, it's okay. Rush Limbaugh said it, it's okay, right? Those are two fundamentally different ways of deciding what knowledge is. And the reason I say it's a depressing talk is she doesn't have an answer. She has a question. How do you teach when people fundamentally disagree on what knowledge even is? Good night.
Well, that's good. I'm just going to go get some sleeping pills and a bottle of wine now. Appreciate that.
So good luck with that.
Got the nice
I'm
whiskey
going
out.
on mute so you don't hear my sobbing. Goodbye.
What a note to end our Q&A on. Woo! You earned that by sticking around to the end. Nice job, everybody. Wild question, Marty. Thank you. Cool, and great job with a marathon there, Dave. How you feeling? How you feeling now, my friend?
Good. I will have to take a bathroom break, and I'm glad we've recorded that.
Yeah. Awesome. I was just going to say, so we have, this is the time of the night. I know folks have been saying their goodbyes, enjoying the conversation. So we are down to the folks who really want to stick it on to the end. We appreciate you. Some folks have mentioned that the chat can be saved. I'm going to save that at the end of the night, as well as the video, because lots of great links and references and things like that have been shared. Dave, are you planning on sharing the video with folks who signed up for the event?
I believe we can. Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Cool. So Dave, should we maybe give folks like a 5-minute bio break, grab a glass of water, hit the bathroom, meet us back here in 5 minutes. We'll explain how Idea Exchange goes, open that up, open up the hallway for people who want to hang out and meet some of other Dave's friends, folks who maybe haven't seen each other in a while. We'll see what that looks like. So we'll be back here. It is currently 6:48 p.m. Eastern time. I'm going to say we're back here at 6:53 p.m. Eastern time. How's that sound?
Awesome.
Cool. Sounds good.
So we have an extra question that they probably didn't think I was going to answer, but my friends, Digger and Rachel, ask, who overcomes greater bias, Rocky and Rocky 4 or Johnny 5? I think that is an amazing question, because Johnny 5 has to overcome, the bias that's literally programmed into him. Whereas Rocky has to overcome the bias that's being, sent down to him from like Reagan around the Russians. I honestly, if I have to answer, I would say Rocky. And the way you can tell is he realizes that if he can change and you can change, then we can change. I think the proof's right there. I think it's Rocky.
That's a great answer. I love it. Dave, would you like to explain the story context and the expectations for Idea Exchange?
Sure. So I have been doing for a while now this thing called Idea Exchange. It's rooted in, I'm going to play tribute to a guy some of us on this call may know. But Brad Graham was a wonderful guy who was there in the early days of South by Southwest. He's literally invented the word blogosphere. But there's a time when South by Southwest was just a bunch of bloggers who got together, and it was the only time of year they saw each other. And he would have this tradition on the opening night of South by Southwest called Break Bread with Brad. And we'd get together and we would see each other again for the first time in a year, and it was really nice. Brad Graham passed away in 2010, and we miss him dearly. And to honor what he did and how he tried to bring people together, I started doing a thing at South by Southwest called Dunk Donuts with Dave. Now, Brad used to have a thing where it's like the name tag, instead of saying, hello, my name is, it said, hello, my URL is, because early 2000s. And my tribute to that was, lately I've been thinking about blank, right? And people would fill in that blank and they'd get together and start chatting. When I brought that tradition to Philadelphia, I started calling it Idea Exchange, but we still had donuts. And the idea is you just come in and you fill out your tag and it says, lately I've been thinking about blank. And then you walk around and you see someone's name tag and they're like, oh, so you've been thinking about balloon animals. Tell me about that, right? And it was this great thing where folks who, like me, who are kind of, I'm super extroverted in something like this where I'm getting on a stage and talking. But if I have to go to a cocktail party where I don't know anybody, screw that, right? But if I have this thing to latch onto, like, oh, you've been interested in hydroponics, tell me about that, right? Like, I feel more comfortable and people really seem to like that. So it's my party. So I wanted to use this opportunity to get a whole bunch of people together and do some version of that. Now, obviously, when you're in person, you can kind of break off into groups physically easily. Here, we're gonna have to kind of like random draw it, and we're gonna be going into breakout rooms. And I don't know if you saw the note in the Google Doc directing you here, but if you did get a chance to think about the answer to the question, what have you been thinking about lately? And you can write it down, like here I've written down mine. I actually have lately, I've been thinking about stickers. But even if you have it on a sticky, or if right now you want to think about, well, what would I answer to that question? Lately I've been thinking about, you can write it down or just say it when you get into your breakout room. But the idea is when you go to your breakout room, we're all about to break out into groups of 5. When you go to your breakout room, just start chatting about what you've been thinking about lately. And we'll do that for about 20 minutes. Then we're going to shuffle you into a whole other room, be there with another group of people for 20 minutes, and then do it one more time. And then with whatever time is left, we can all hang out in the hallway to say our final goodbyes. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody want to unmute with any questions they have about this?
I'm just going to go over the logistics document again. I got to find that.
Yeah, if we want to drop that in Slack, if you want to Slack in the chat, everything is Slack now for people to reference. All right, everybody ready? And I'll be hopping around from room to room, so I might be.
And real quick, Dave. So we're giving folks 20 minutes. So if we start this right now, let's call it 7 o'clock. We'll be bringing folks back here at 7:20. We'll regroup in this room and then split up into a new set of random rooms. So 6 to 6:20 is what you've got. I will also post the link to Rally, which again, that logistics doc, if you want to open that up, or if you want to open up Rally, if you want to explore, again, sort of the hallway side of the conversation, you can come on over to Rally. There's a guest login. I will say that with the caveat that Rally's new technology. So if the hallway breaks, we're not to be held responsible, but we're trying an experiment, and myself and Maurice will be over in the hallway. So come over and say hello at some point if you like. But with that, I think Brianna, if you're ready to go, we're ready to go.
Wow. Did everyone enjoy their room?
Big time.
Yeah, we were in mid conversation and the machine brought us back. Literally, somebody was literally talking and we just got whoop, came back.
It's like being unplugged from the Matrix.
Yeah, that happens every time.
I don't think
it's a
we've
little
ever
more
been unplugged from the
absolute when
Matrix.
it's virtual.
By the way, I don't know about other groups, but in our group, a couple folks renamed their names to be their tag. So if you want to do that, you just click on your picture, and then options show up. One of them is rename, and if you do that, you can rename your thing. So you can. It's like you're wearing your little tag.
It only gets awkward once you start emailing later. That's great.
Wait, nope, I don't think everybody in my group had tags. I'm gonna have to make a tag.
Oh, I didn't know about tags, but can I be the Frankenstein?
Yeah,
It's the internet. You can be whoever you'd like.
All right.
On the internet, everyone's a dog.
Yep, there we go.
All right, I've got my tag. I gotta tape it to my chest.
Here's how we do it.
All right, is everybody ready to get reshuffled?
I'm gonna hold my tag up because I can't find tape. So.
So what did you write on your tag? Zero data. Okay, first I thought it's Zorro. I'm like, could have worked.
It's a, yeah, no, I'm going to save that for the conversation in my breakout, but zero data is the thing I'm thinking about all the time now.
All right, we're breaking out. Hi.
All right, are we in a breakout room or did nothing
No.
happen?
Nothing happened.
Nothing
Let's
happened.
rule.
Here we go.
There we go.
All rooms. We're going.
Hi, can we do this more often?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to speak for Dave, but yes, I'm guessing that means you're having a good time, Agnes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
How
Fantastic.
about
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, I'm having a blast today. This has been wonderful.
This is fantastic.
Agnes, how do you know of Dave?
I regularly attend the Quarantine Book Club
Ah, cool.
with Erica Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Mike Monteiro, and he was in quite a few of them, and I found out about his book.
That's awesome. Those are
So-
some great people too.
Yeah, awesome. And they invite really cool people, like Dave.
Like, yeah.
Alex has been on there too.
Yeah, because of Dave. Dave was like, Alex need to go
I
on this show.
missed that. Oh, and the bummer thing is, and I get reprimanded for bringing this up, but they never get recorded.
So Agnes, I was going to ask you because a couple weeks ago, Mike mentioned this, but I must have missed the episode where he explained why they don't record their.
I
What is
missed
the
that
reason?
too.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
I have seen, I don't want to, this is not I'm absolutely not putting words in their mouth, but I have seen something really kind of special about, and I suppose this is true if where you're in the breakout rooms, because those aren't being recorded. There's something nice about not being on the record.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, just, different conversations and more people are going to speak more freely. So I think that's pretty cool.
All right, everybody ready for one more round?
But Alex, one thing, how about the pearls of wisdom that just suddenly emerged?
Oh, that don't get recorded. Yeah, I think it would be nice if somebody took notes and did a summary. That
It's
would be nice.
like a permission in the moment to go on the record for
That's
something
right.
otherwise off the record.
That's right. Brianna, before you send folks into the room, Dave, I wanted to tell you that I'm going to have to split off in a couple of minutes, probably during this session. So I wanted to say thank you to everybody who's here, and maybe do one more quick round of Zoom applause for Dave and his new book. I feel so good. I don't know why I feel so good. So I hope you carry that tradition into your other Zoom events that you attend and things like that. Carry that Indie Hall tradition forward. This was a blast. Enjoy your last session. The other thing is the way the Zoom room works is this is sort of a last person out. So you will be able to hang out here afterwards. I'll close down the room tonight. It's one of the nice things about a virtual space. It's not like a bar where I got to bounce you out. So I'll leave the room open until later today.
And Alex, thank you so
Alex.
much for moderating and for being a good friend.
I'm glad to be yours, man. And it was nice to meet so many of you. I hope to see you back at future events. Right before you came back, Dave, Agnes was asking, can we do this more often? And I said, that's up to Dave, but I'm certainly game for it.
I think we can figure something out. The live podcast recordings are going to be a little bit like this, but yeah, we should totally do this again.
Let's see, and everybody's filtering back in.
So I have to finish a point I was making that's going to make no sense to everyone, but we'll get there. So I was talking about season 1 of Lost. At the end of season 1 of Lost, the good guys kind of have to band together with this one character named Locke, who's a little bit of a fanatic. And they're banding together with him, making preparations for an incoming attack. And one of the characters says to another, hey, look, if this works, if we survive this attack, we're going to have a Locke problem. Right now, as we're getting to the point of maybe Lockwood, cross fingers, do whatever you got to do, maybe there's no Trump next year, maybe we're going to have a 60 million Americans problem. Because 60 million Americans thought it would be a pretty damn good idea if he were in charge. They're still going to be here. And at least 40 million of them are still going to think it was a good idea. So yeah, it isn't just about transparency when we talk about good versus evil, but that transparency means, hey, this thing that you are in fact weren't ashamed to say, this is how I'm doing it, this is how I'm manipulating you. There were 40 million people who were like, yeah, go ahead. I'll give you another example, actually. On Radiolab, they did an episode where they talked about Russian trolls coming in and manipulating people into doing political action on Facebook, right? So it's like, hey, I'm going to get a whole bunch of Russian trolls out there, and we're going to convince you to hold a pro-Trump rally. And they would do it, not knowing it was Russian trolls doing it. They would come back later and be like, hey, I'm going to point to all the stuff that shows, yeah, it was in fact, you thought it was some rando in your neighborhood. No, these were Russians who convinced you to hold that rally. How do you feel about that? And they would be like, nah, I'm still pretty cool with it. Right? Like, because it wasn't about who motivated them. It was about they really believed in the rally. So what democracy does, especially in an administration that isn't really trying to be all that subterfugey, it reveals who you really are. So that, I mean, going back to that thing I was saying before about two different systems of belief, yeah, we're going to have to figure that out.
I need more booze. I'm sorry. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dave, I've definitely been thinking about that because he's also going to have a TV show. I mean, and think about the bile that Hannity spews out. You know,
I mean,
Trump's going to have 20 times the audience of Hannity.
Yeah, and Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, and I mean that's
all of
not
them.
new. That's been getting us here. But that's Fox News. They've been trying to do Fox News since pre-Nixon. But especially in the early days. So there's, if you ever see the movie Vice, they talk about this. Like all of that as a concept for political advantage has been in the works for a very, very, very long time, and eventually caught on. So it's not that this moment isn't new by any means, but yeah.
So I want to tie it back for those who weren't in the room when we started that piece. Just to the thing that had been brought it up, what we were talking about was what David had asked earlier of Dave about how to figure out whether the manipulation of something is ethical or not ethical, right? Like if it's for good or for evil or something of that nature. And Dave's answer had been about disclosure. And the reason, and basically what we were talking about was basically Trump as an example of like full disclosure all the time because there is no subtext. There are no more dog whistles. It's just whistles, right? There's no subtext. It's all text. And so we were talking about how disclosure, I guess, like, I mean, where we might have been headed is like disclosure only works if the person has some value set that causes them to have shame, right? Like Dave, like you were saying, right, that like when you get that tingly thing that says that you may be doing something that's wrong, like that's shame, that's values, that there's something there. And otherwise, if you don't have it, if you think that ends justify the means, or you subscribe to any number of different philosophical bents on the world, right? Like you can answer that question. You can disclose fully what you're doing and not care because you don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Well, I'd go so far as to say that, like in that case, you're no longer dealing with manipulation, right? Like I think my suspicion is that a lot of Trump's charisma is accidental. That he does not walk on stage and think to himself, if I do this in just this way, with just this timbre of voice, with just these pauses, I'm going to woo the crowd. I think he just gets up there like your drunk racist uncle and just starts talking. I don't think he thought he was going to win. But because the country is the way the country is, and at a certain time in a certain place, he did. Because there were 60 million people who were like, yeah, I actually like my racist drunk uncle. And I don't think he's so racist, right?
Yeah. Well, but because if they think any of the same things, then they have to acknowledge that they're racist. But somebody else validating it, saying, this is a perfectly reasonable mainstream won the presidency way to think. I'm not a racist. That guy thinks it.
Right. Yeah. Well, we've also had a system where the elite has more and more, and the establishment has ignored a lot of, I mean, there are parts of the country and parts of the world where just, you know, nothing has gotten better for a long time. And I think Trump fed on that frustration.
Well, we've known this guy for a long time, right? He hasn't really changed that much since he was just a businessman back in New York, and everybody in New York City knew exactly who he was.
The term is grifter. Yeah.
So, and to your point, and choice of term, you can't completely let him off the hook as just this guy who gets up in front of a microphone and just spews out whatever comes on. He is aware to a large degree of the influence he is trying to have. He just may not necessarily be aware of the actual influence that he does have as at the end result. And that's a wonderful point, this whole notion that he could basically have stumbled into greatness, so to speak, because the timing was right for the message that he was giving out for a certain segment of the population. And, you know, a whole bunch of ills combined to allow that to translate to the presidency of the United States, which I can't believe I just said in like one full breath, all of that stuff. But, you know.
Yeah, and I don't want to let him off the hook. It's more that he is an opportunist rather than a planner.
He's not a schemer.
Yeah,
exactly.
No,
Don't
but
like a schemer to you.
Intelligent enough to calculate things.
I've got a question.
He just
for you.
happens upon things.
I've got a question for you then, Dave, because I think a lot of this even goes back to cognitive bias. If you think about what Trump is doing from a behavioral economic standpoint, he's a system one thinker only. He doesn't have a system two of higher level thinking. It's, this is my gut and I'm going to say it and that's it. And when you think, especially during the election, when he was talking, if you go back and look at the transcripts, he has maybe 10 statements with things as simple as, I'm going to build a wall. But he doesn't go into the next 10 steps of, here's how I'm going to build it. This is the plan for how we're going to build it. And these are the long-term effects that are going to come out of this. So part of the question is, when you look at those transcripts and what he was saying, we're all cognitively biased in wanting to hear something out of it that makes sense to us. And none of what he was saying made sense. So you look at the transcript and it's gobbledygook. But intellectually, we hear things, and because he wasn't saying enough and we weren't questioning him enough, the people who were listening to him were biased to read between the lines to add what they felt he was saying. And because he wasn't saying enough to conflict with that, they let it slide by, and now we're stuck in this situation. So I'm curious what that bias looks like. Or is there a name for that particular fill in the blank bias that we, at least most of the Republicans fell for to put him in office?
It's called the Forer effect, also known as the P.T. Barnum effect, for perhaps obvious reasons. So you have a guy who comes up to you and says, I can read minds. And I start saying, all right, you're thinking about, you had a relative who I feel like they were uncertain about something in their life, and they reached out to you for help. Is this coming clear to me? I think maybe it starts with an M or an N, maybe an E is in there, right? And odds are I am throwing such huge swings. Someone who is uncertain about something in their life. Is anyone on this call certain about everything in their life? Had a relative? Everyone on this call probably had a relative, came to it for advice at some point in your life. You know, right? I'm taking such big swings that it's really easy for you to be like, I do have a relative. I'm even picking letters of the alphabet that are super common. They did have an M in their name, right? And it is taking advantage of the fact that people do like to fill in the blanks. So Make America Great Again is one of the most powerful slogans, because whatever beef you have with America at that moment, oh, these damn immigrants, oh, I'm out of a job, oh, these dangerous Black people, you can read Make America Great Again as solving that. It is a great coalition builder, because even if you and I have completely different beefs with America, surely we can make America great again. We can agree that we want to make America again. And not for nothing, Yes We Can is an excellent slogan for the exact same reason.
I was just going to say that.
Yes we can. What? You tell me. What do you think it is that we need to do? Now, it's a somewhat more proactive one, but still, and it doesn't happen to be borrowed from Nazi rhetoric from the 30s, but still, it is a very for effect friendly slogan. So you're absolutely right. There is a bias for that. I want to see, does everyone have access to the Rally link that's in the Google Doc? Everyone know where to find that? Or can we throw it into the
Somebody
chat?
drop that again at the bottom just to make that easy.
Let me make sure. I'm going to put a link here and somebody can. Oh, look, somebody took care of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafe. So I'm going to ask us to shuffle over to Rally now and keep the conversation going. It's the after party.
Hey.
And also someone please save the chat. But thank you all so much. This has been an amazing party. I'm so happy to see all of your faces. Let's do one more Spirit Fingers, just for all of us.
Yay.
And I will see you in Rally if you want to join. Thank you.